A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Jesus and his disciples set out for the villages of Caesarea Philippi. Along the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" They said in reply, "John the Baptist, others Elijah, still others one of the prophets." And he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter said to him in reply, "You are the Christ." Then he warned them not to tell anyone about him. He began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer greatly and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed and rise after 3 days. He spoke this openly. Then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. At this, he turned around and, looking at his disciples, rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. You are thinking not as God does, but as human beings do." He summoned the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "Whoever wishes to come after me must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake and for that of the gospel will save it." The Gospel of the Lord. In a book titled "This I Believe" by J. Allison, there is a series of essays, and these essays are by famous people. These essays contain life episodes which have affected them deeply. These are episodes which have somehow shaped their philosophy of life and also shaped their personalities. For example, James DuPont of the DuPont Company recalls one such episode that took place in his life when he was just 7 years old. It seems one night he was awakened from his sleep. It was around midnight and he could hear his mother sobbing loudly. It was the first time that he heard his mother cry. And he heard that his father was trying to comfort his mother with troubled and in a low voice. And he was trying to comfort her, but in their anguish, they forgot that the son's bedroom was just nearby. And he overheard them. Now, while the problem because of which this particular incident took place was long solved and forgotten, the discovery that young James DuPont made that night remained with him for life. And this was the discovery he made. He discovered that life is not always full of hearts and flowers. It is also sometimes full of sorrow, cruelty, and hardships. I am sure we can all relate to what this little 7-year-old experienced in his life. We too must have heard how mothers cry. We too must have had some impact of witnessing this particular event. And probably, or perhaps, we must come to this realization that life is not all hearts and flowers. It is also sometimes cruel and hard. And so we can relate to what Jesus said in today's Gospel. "If anyone wants to follow me, let him forget himself. Let him carry his cross and come with me and follow me." And that is what life is all about. To come to this realization that there are sorrows, there are sufferings, and the sorrows and sufferings in our life are like droughts and floods. They are part and parcel of our life. And no matter what we do, at sometimes we cannot escape them. Jesus goes on to say something very remarkable in today's Gospel. He says, Jesus goes on to say something remarkable. He says, "Those who wish to save their lives will lose it. But those who lose their lives for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. And that is what Jesus is also trying to imply, that while life is full of sorrows and sufferings, we can do something about them. And that is the important part. Not just having sorrows or sufferings in your life, but what you do about it, how you deal with it. While we cannot escape sorrows and suffering, we can do something positive about it. We can turn them into something constructive, not destructive. We can turn them into something that is life giving, not death dealing. And that is Jesus' message for today. Let me illustrate this. We all know the life of Saint Ignatius of Loyola. He began as a soldier, and in one of the battles, he was gravely injured, almost nearly shattering his right leg. And it was at this time, while he was convalescing in a castle, he longed to read books which dealt with the romances of chivalry, his favorite reading. But there were none in the castle. And then at this time, his sister-in-law brought in books which dealt with the lives of Christ and of the saints. And reading these books, he was inspired. And we know the rest is history. Saint Ignatius of Loyola learned to deal with his sorrows and suffering. While he was convalescing, he did not focus on the injuries that he had, but he focused on the injuries he had in his heart. And he longed to follow saints like Saint Francis of Assisi and the older monks. And that's what helped him to have a religious conversion. We too are called to look at sorrows and suffering in a different way. We too are called to react to sorrows and sufferings constructively, to respond to them in a more life-giving way. And that is what is the reality of life. If we do not pick up sorrows and suffering, if we do not pick up these crosses that come across our life, we will surely lose our lives. And so, by way of summary, if you go back to the story of the 7-year-old boy that I just spoke of, we too will discover that life is not all flowers and hearts, but also cruel and hard. But there is another discovery. Thanks to Jesus and the gospel, we discover that life is all, rather the sorrows and suffering that we have in life are not always death-dealing. Thanks to Jesus, they are also life-giving. And sorrows and suffering, just like the crosses in our life, are something that we need to pick up if we need to grow. And we need to grow into warmer people, humbler people, compassionate people, and a more understanding people. Suffering and sorrows are part and parcel of our life, and they can always be life-giving and not always death-dealing. Amen.
My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me.